When Rowan Hale was fired from Wexford Automotive, they called him a liability who had nearly destroyed the fastest production test vehicle in America. Nobody outside that building knew the report used to terminate him had been altered, or that the design keeping their flagship record alive was built on his work. 18 months later, Rowan arrived at a desert proving ground with a car assembled in a private garage. No corporate logo, no professional pit crew, only 6 mechanics and a vehicle the industry had already dismissed. When the engine turned over, CEO Celeste Wexford recognized a sound that should not have been possible. Stay with this story through the final lap, where Rowan forces an entire empire to hear the truth about itself. 18 months before Rowan Hale drove anything across a Nevada desert, he was the man no press release named but every serious engineer at Wexford Automotive quietly knew. He had spent 17 years inside the company's advanced testing division, moving from junior thermal analyst to the lead integration engineer on every high-performance hybrid program the company had attempted. His name appeared on internal schematics, on fault analysis memos, and on the whiteboard drawings that preceded every major breakthrough, but never on a product launch banner or an investor briefing slide. Wexford Automotive was preparing to unveil the Dominion R9, a hybrid test vehicle representing nearly $300 million in development funding, and the plan was to use it to break the company's own standing record, a sustained average speed of 201.8 miles per hour, maintained continuously over 24 hours on a closed-loop track. The record had existed for 11 years. The merger deal Wexford was negotiating, worth several $billion, depended on demonstrating that the company's engineering capabilities still led the industry. Rowan had spent 8 months running thermal simulations on the R9's battery management architecture, and by late spring he had identified something that no one above him wanted to hear. The system accumulated heat in a predictable cycle, performing beautifully in short bursts and across the first several hours of operation, but storing residual thermal energy in the outer battery clusters in a way that the active cooling array could not fully compensate. His models showed the problem would remain invisible until roughly the 17th hour of a continuous run, at which point internal temperatures would spike well beyond safe operating range. He submitted the findings formally, flagged the run as premature, and requested a minimum 6-week delay to redesign the cooling manifold. Preston Caldwell, the company's executive vice president and the architect of the merger timeline, denied the request within 3 hours. The investors had already been scheduled, the press credentials had already been issued, and the track at Red Mesa had already been reserved. Caldwell informed Rowan that his objections were noted and dismissed, then scheduled a meeting with Celeste Wexford, the company's 39-year-old CEO, who had inherited both the company and the pressure of proving she deserved to lead it, and framed Rowan's concerns as the reflexive caution of an engineer who feared being made irrelevant by technology he had not developed himself. Rowan requested access to the meeting and was granted 5 minutes. He placed a printed thermal model on the table in front of Celeste, pointed to the projected failure window between hours 17 and 19, and said the vehicle was not ready for a 24-hour sustained run. Celeste studied the document, asked 2 technical questions, and gave him 48 hours to submit supporting data from live hardware tests. That evening, when Rowan logged into the R9's engineering control system to begin pulling the data she had requested, he found that a sequence of override commands had been entered using his own authentication credentials, commands that had removed the upper thermal limits from the battery management software. The timestamp showed the modifications had been made during a 3-hour window when Rowan had not been in the building. On the central display, an authorization log showed a digital signature tied to his employee account approving every change. The test proceeded before Rowan could reach Celeste again. In the first 8 hours, the Dominion R9 ran like a precision instrument, smooth and powerful, and Caldwell stood in the observation gallery, making a point of his composure while Rowan stood at the back of the room, watching the thermal readouts climb in the pattern he had predicted. The assembled board of directors received live performance data curated by Caldwell's team, a feed that omitted the battery temperature subsystem. Tate Brennan, Wexford's lead test driver and the most experienced pilot the company employed, kept the car on pace with the kind of precision only years of professional development driving could produce. When the failure arrived, it came exactly where Rowan's model said it would. Not as a catastrophic event, but as a sharp imbalance in the rear cooling loop that sent a shudder through the drivetrain and triggered an automatic power reduction cascade. Tate read the car correctly, pulled back on the pace, and guided the R9 into the technical bay without drama or danger. There was no fire, no wreck, no injury. There was only a stopped test, a room full of embarrassed executives, and several $100 million worth of vehicles sitting on a jack with smoke rising from its rear cooling assembly. Caldwell moved within the hour. He distributed an incident summary to the board stating that Rowan Hale had tampered with the vehicle's thermal override settings and then submitted false data in an attempt to manufacture a failure that would support his earlier objections. When Rowan demanded access to the raw system logs to demonstrate that his account had been used without his knowledge, Caldwell informed the board that the original log files had been overwritten by the diagnostic sequence Rowan had initiated. Celeste stood in the design hall with the board watching and made a decision she would spend the next year and a half rethinking. She told the head of security to retrieve Rowan's access card, and she told Rowan that his employment was terminated effective immediately. Rowan did not raise his voice. He did not threaten litigation or break down in front of the colleagues who watched through glass walls as a 17-year career ended between one breath and the next. He gathered the few personal items from his workstation and moved toward the exit. Before he reached the door, his eyes passed across a monitor running a diagnostic feed from the R9, and on that screen, he recognized something that stopped him mid-step. The control architecture running the vehicle's power distribution system, the fundamental logic governing how the R9 balanced torque output against thermal load, carried a structural signature he knew because he had written it. It was not a coincidence of engineering convention or a parallel solution arrived at independently. The variable weighting loops, the thermal priority flags, the fallback sequencing. It was the same framework he had built 11 years earlier for a much earlier prototype, and a version of that framework had been registered under Wexford's corporate intellectual property without his name attached. The car Wexford was preparing to use to defend a record was running on code that predated the company's own patent filing by several months. He turned to Celeste one final time before leaving, and he told her, with the quiet certainty of someone who has already run the numbers, that the vehicle she was betting the company's future on was not protecting a record. It was counting down to the moment it destroyed one. The garage Rowan returned to had belonged to his father, a machinist who had spent 40 years building things with his hands before the work finished him. The building still smelled of cutting oil and steel shavings, and the walls still held the shadow outlines of tools long since moved or sold. He sat on the concrete floor for an hour before doing anything else, not from grief but from the particular stillness of a man who has just run out of ways to compromise. 11 years earlier, Rowan had been a mid-level analyst assigned to the Dominion R7 program, one of a dozen engineers trying to solve the overheating problem that kept the company's record attempt stalled. The car was fast in short intervals but lost thermal stability after 3 or 4 hours at race speed, and every proposed solution either compromised performance or added weight the chassis couldn't carry. The program had been running behind schedule for 14 months when Rowan requested permission to test a computational approach rather than a mechanical one, a request his supervisor at the time approved without enthusiasm and without funding, meaning the work was done on Rowan's own time using a simulation license he paid for himself. Rowan had stayed at the garage 3 nights in a row working on a different approach. Not a hardware modification, but an algorithmic one. He called it silent pulse. Instead of reacting to overheating after it began, the system predicted it by reading real-time temperature gradients across each motor cluster and shifting power distribution proactively, smoothing the thermal load before it could accumulate. The Dominion R7 ran the first successful 24-hour test 2 weeks after Silent Pulse was integrated, and it set the record of 201.8 miles per hour that Wexford had been defending ever since. The announcement press conference happened while Rowan was sitting in a hospital room with his wife, who had received a diagnosis 3 days before the record attempt. He had requested leave, signed nothing at the formal completion ceremony, and returned to find that the official record documentation carried the names of the program management team. Caldwell's name appeared. Rowan's did not. He had considered challenging it, had consulted an attorney who told him the case was viable but long and expensive, and had made the practical decision that a sick wife and a young daughter required a steady income more urgently than historical credit. Now the daughter was 19 and studying industrial design. The wife was buried in a cemetery 20 minutes from the garage, and the income was gone. Rowan unlocked the fireproof cabinet he had never opened at work and spread its contents across the wooden bench. Spiral notebooks with dates running back 14 years, printed simulation outputs, hand-drawn schematics, and 2 external drives that had never been connected to a Wexford networked machine. The drives held every version of Silent Pulse from its earliest iteration to the final release, each file time-stamped months before the company's patent application had been submitted. He could file a lawsuit. He had the documentation to support one, and the recent termination gave him renewed grounds. But a lawsuit moved through institutions and ended with settlements that contained confidentiality clauses, and the people who had spent 17 years benefiting from his anonymity would continue to benefit from it. Rowan looked at the photograph on the wall, a press image of the Dominion R7 crossing a finishing line in the Nevada sun, and decided the only argument worth making was one that couldn't be redacted or sealed. He pulled a blank sheet from a drafting pad and drew the first line of something new. The frame Rowan started with had been scrapped from a failed startup that had dissolved in bankruptcy 3 years earlier. A lightweight test chassis designed for a fuel cell program that never got past the prototype stage, missing its powertrain, its bodywork, and any hope of meeting competition specifications in its current condition. He found it in a storage lot outside Reno, paid a small fraction of its original fabrication cost, and towed it back to the garage on a rented trailer. He called Mara Quinn the following morning. Mara had spent 12 years as Wexford's most skilled chassis fabricator before Caldwell had reassigned credit for her work on a major frame redesign to a team he managed directly, and she had resigned 6 months later rather than continue contributing to a record that bore other people's names. She listened to Rowan's proposal for 30 seconds and said she needed 2 days to finish a freelance project before she could start. Eli Boone opened his machine shop to the project without hesitation, offering night access to his equipment in exchange for a single condition. If the car ever competed publicly, the name of Boone Fabrication would be cut into the chassis plate. Eli's shop was 3 months from defaulting on its lease, and the arrangement cost him nothing he wasn't already risking. Rowan brought in 3 additional mechanics through Mara's network, each one a specialist who had left or been pushed out of corporate automotive work and was willing to contribute skills in exchange for a piece of something they could actually claim as their own. The engineering principles Rowan imposed on the build were precise and uncompromising. The car would not attempt to win on raw power. It would win by surviving better than anything else on the course. Every system had a mechanical fallback that could operate without electronic input. Every component had to be serviceable with tools that fit in a standard rolling cart. The weight target was aggressive enough that the team spent 2 weeks removing material from parts that already felt impossibly light. Mara had a habit of welding test brackets at midnight and leaving them on a bench for Rowan to find in the morning, each one slightly different from the last. A running conversation in metal about stress tolerances neither of them felt the need to narrate aloud. Eli contributed not just the machine shop but a kind of institutional memory, 40 years of knowing what broke under real conditions rather than simulated ones, and what industry specs quietly allowed for that no one ever built to in practice. The team developed a rhythm over the following months, a quiet professional fluency built around the shared understanding that every decision made in the garage would eventually be tested at 200 miles per hour in the dark. Avery drove up from the university one weekend to see how the project was progressing and found her father crouched beneath a stripped frame in the middle of the garage floor talking to Mara about stress distribution in the suspension mounting points. She walked around the chassis slowly, studying its angles, and told him it looked like a chess piece, upright, compact, with an economy of form that suggested threat rather than speed. She said it should be called the Rook. Rowan looked at the frame for a moment and didn't disagree. The first engine start happened on a cold morning 7 months into the build. The sound was not dramatic, a low, even idle that held its tone without hunting or surging. But Mara heard in its steadiness the resolution of the problem that had destroyed the R9's test day, and she stood with her arms folded and her head slightly tilted, listening for the flaw that wasn't there. The team filed for independent entry in the Wexford Automotive Record Defense event, a sanctioned 24-hour closed course run overseen by an independent competition authority. Under the name Hale Performance Group, the entry was technically open to outside participants, a provision that existed largely as a formality no one had ever seriously invoked. The competition authority confirmed the application was valid, imposed a mandatory 100-mile qualifying run with a minimum performance threshold, and required an entry fee that Rowan's budget could not currently cover. The deadline was 12 days away. He was still solving the funding problem when a certified letter arrived from Wexford Automotive's legal department, accusing him of misappropriating proprietary technical information and requesting an emergency injunction to bar the Hale Rook from the event. Caldwell's calculation was straightforward. The injunction did not need to succeed in court, only to consume enough of Rowan's time and money that the entry fee couldn't be paid and the qualifying run couldn't be completed. Rowan had anticipated this precise move. From the first week of the build, he had engaged an independent technical auditor to document every phase of the design and fabrication, a film record of each component, each decision, each supplier invoice, creating a clear chain of evidence demonstrating that the Hale Rook contained nothing sourced from Wexford's proprietary systems. The same documentation that traced the car's origins also traced the origins of Silent Pulse back to Rowan's notebooks, establishing prior art that predated Wexford's relevant patents. The injunction request was denied within 72 hours. The legal skirmish had one real casualty. The small equipment sponsor who had committed to covering the entry fee withdrew the morning the lawsuit was announced, unwilling to be attached to litigation involving a major corporation. Rowan stood in the garage doing arithmetic on a pad and arriving at the same number regardless of how he arranged the figures. Eli quietly offered to pledge the machine shop as collateral against a short-term loan. Rowan refused to let his friend's livelihood become the price of a personal account. The solution came from an unexpected direction. Delaney Pierce, who ran an independent tooling company that supplied specialty fabrication shops across the Southwest, had been following the legal dispute through industry contacts and reached out directly. She had spent 20 years building a business by backing engineers who were right when institutions said they were wrong, and she recognized the pattern in Rowan's situation with the clarity of someone who had lived a version of it herself. She offered to cover the remaining entry fee and fund the final tire purchase, not in exchange for equity or licensing rights, but for one condition: that the Hale Rook compete under its own name and the names of the people who built it, publicly and in full. Rowan accepted. The money transferred the following morning, and he submitted the entry paperwork with 4 hours remaining before the deadline. While this was happening, Celeste Wexford was working through a separate problem. She had learned about the injunction from a news alert rather than from her own legal team, and when she asked Caldwell for the authorization record, she discovered he had filed the action using standing authority delegated to him for routine matters, deliberately keeping it off her approval queue. She said nothing about this to anyone in the building. Instead, she spent a Saturday morning in the company's secured data archive with a temporary access credential she had not used in years, searching the backup systems for files that should have been preserved automatically. She found Rowan's original thermal model, the one submitted 3 days before the failed test. The document's metadata showed it had been received, logged, and then removed from the board preparation package before the test day briefings. The deletion timestamp was 2 hours after Caldwell had received the full file bundle. At the bottom of the document, in the audit trail section that survived even targeted deletions, was a detail that changed every calculation she had been making. Rowan's account had been locked for external access 18 minutes before the override commands that destroyed the test were logged against his credentials. He had not been in the system. He had been locked out of it. The person who framed him for the sabotage had first ensured that the sabotage would be traceable only to him. The qualifying run took place on a cold Tuesday at a small regional track 60 miles from Reno. The Hale Rook arrived in a borrowed trailer with no corporate infrastructure around it, no data engineers in a climate-controlled support vehicle, no matching crew uniforms, no secondary chassis waiting in reserve. It was a gray car with raw edges, a paint finish that had been applied in the garage and showed brush marks under direct light, and an instrument panel that used physical gauges where the Wexford fleet used high-resolution digital displays. The Wexford technical staff observing the qualifier made their assessments openly, referring to the car as a hobbyist project and to the team as a collection of people who had failed to make it in professional automotive work. Rowan suited up and drove the first lap himself, at a pace that looked cautious against the benchmark times posted on the board. By the 40th mile, every other vehicle on the track that day had made at least one pit stop for thermal management or tire wear. The Hale Rook had not slowed, had not pitted, and had not changed its line. A sensor malfunction in the cooling circuit at mile 62 would have caused any electronically managed car to slow automatically. The Hale Rook's mechanical pressure equalization system adjusted passively, redistributing coolant flow through a differential valve that needed no signal to operate correctly. The car completed the 100 miles with performance degradation that the data recorder measured as negligible. Tate Brennan walked over from the Wexford support area and crouched next to the rear tires. The wear pattern across all 4 contact patches was nearly uniform, a degree of consistency that full factory teams with dedicated tire engineers achieved only occasionally. He said nothing to anyone and returned to his own side of the paddock. Caldwell, watching from a distance, instructed his communications staff to release a statement suggesting that the Hale Rook's qualifying pace was so conservative, it raised doubts about whether the team understood what a sustained record attempt actually required. One day before the main event, a track official reviewing the R9's competition documentation flagged an anomaly. The vehicle's power distribution software carried an authentication signature embedded by a third-party contributor. The signature resolved to Rowan Hale. Wexford's entry forms had listed all technology as proprietary and internally developed. Celeste arrived at the garage on a Tuesday night, alone, with no assistant and no security detail. She had not told the board she was going, and she had not told Caldwell. She had told no one. The drive out of the city took 40 minutes, and she spent most of it rehearsing how to begin a conversation she had no precedent for, an apology that was also an investigation, a visit that was also a reckoning. Rowan opened the door without much expression and offered her the same stool he kept near the workbench when Mara was working. The Hale Rook sat in the center of the floor, fully assembled, its gray surface catching the shop light evenly. Celeste looked at it for a long moment, and then told him she had found the backup archive file. She told him she knew about the timestamp, about the account lockout, about the deletion 2 hours after Caldwell had received the full document bundle. Rowan said he had known from the beginning that someone with system-level access was responsible, but that he had no way to prove it without internal records that only a current employee could retrieve. She asked him why he had not pursued a legal challenge immediately. He told her the answer was the same as the reason he had stayed quiet 11 years earlier. The process would have taken years and consumed everything he had, and the outcome still would not have put his name in the record where it belonged. He told her the car in front of her was the only legal filing that mattered to him. Celeste asked if there was a number, a settlement figure, a title, a public statement. That would satisfy him before the event. Rowan said she was asking the wrong question. He told her he did not want to be paid to stay quiet, and he did not want a position that could be eliminated the next time a board decided his presence was inconvenient. He wanted the Hale Rook to run its 24 hours under independent observation, and he wanted whatever the data said to be the permanent official result. Celeste looked at the car again and asked how confident he was. He told her to read the thermal model on the bench. She read it for 12 minutes without speaking, and when she looked up, she did not ask any further questions about confidence. She left without committing to anything explicitly, but Rowan noticed that she folded the thermal model and put it in her jacket pocket, rather than leaving it on the bench. Red Mesa Proving Grounds sat in the flat heart of the Nevada desert, a closed oval of banked asphalt that had been used for record attempts by manufacturers from 6 countries. The track surface was resurfaced every 3 years and held its grip consistently through temperature swings that would have degraded a conventional circuit. The surrounding desert offered no shelter from wind or temperature, which meant the conditions at Red Mesa tested not just power, but the engineering judgment embedded in every thermal and aerodynamic decision the designers had made. Wexford arrived with the infrastructure of a full racing operation. 3 support trucks, a mobile engineering center with live telemetry feeds, a catering facility, a public relations team, and enough branded equipment to fill a small warehouse. Hale Rook arrived in the same trailer that had carried it to the qualifier, with 6 people and the contents of a single tool chest. The contrast was visible enough that the photographers spent the first hour of setup documenting both sides of the paddock. When the 24-hour window opened, the Dominion R9 launched from the start line with the authority of a machine that had been designed and funded to win this exact contest. Tate Brennan held a pace that put the record under immediate pressure, and the car moved with a precision that made clear why Wexford had invested what it had. The Hale Rook followed at a lower pace, and within the first 2 hours of the event, the gap between the two vehicles in cumulative laps was visible enough to support the narrative that had already been written. An underdog making a symbolic effort, significant enough to generate attention, but not serious enough to threaten an outcome. Rowan ignored the gap. His race was not against the R9's lap times. It was against the degradation curve his models predicted for every drivetrain system on both vehicles, and those curves had very different shapes when plotted against time rather than individual lap speed. At the 6-hour mark, his average was below the pace required to beat the standing record. At the 6-hour mark, this was intentional. The first pit stop of consequence came at hour 8, when a mounting bracket for one of the auxiliary cooling lines developed a hairline fracture from vibration. A factory team with a standard parts inventory would have replaced the entire assembly and been back on track in 12 minutes. Mara and Eli had no replacement assembly. They had a 4-inch section of titanium stock, a portable milling unit, and 20 years of combined fabrication experience. They machined a replacement bracket in the pit lane in 6 minutes, installed it in another 4, and sent the car back onto the track. The R9 pitted during this window as well, for a scheduled tire rotation that the Wexford strategy team had built into their plan. The time differential between the two cars did not change. Caldwell, watching from the engineering center, instructed Tate to increase pace and extend the lead before the overnight hours, wanting the event decided before the desert temperature dropped and the atmospheric conditions shifted. Tate acknowledged the instruction and added 2 miles per hour to his average, a change that was well within the R9's capability envelope. The gap widened. By midnight, the Dominion R9 was 11 laps ahead in cumulative distance. Then the desert did what deserts do in the small hours. The ambient temperature dropped 14 degrees in 90 minutes, and the thermal landscape of the two cars reversed. The R9 had been running at a calibration optimized for the afternoon heat, and as the air cooled, the management system struggled to rebalance, running the heating elements to prevent battery undertemperature while simultaneously managing residual heat from the day's performance output. It was an inelegant compromise, and it cost time in slightly longer pit cycles and marginally reduced pace. The Hale Rook had no heating elements. It had been designed around the assumption that mechanical systems behaved most predictably when they were kept within a narrow temperature band, and the cooling architecture achieved this through passive airflow management that worked whether the ambient air was hot or cold. Rowan increased his pace without prompting from the pit wall. He did not need a data engineer to tell him the window had opened. He could feel it in the way the car moved through the corners, the grip available at turn entry, the sound the engine made when it was pulling cleanly rather than managing its own heat. Over the next 5 hours, the gap between the two vehicles reduced from 11 laps to 3. Caldwell stared at the timing screens in the engineering center and made a decision that Tate Brennan had been fearing for the previous hour. He ordered the R9 into performance mode, a software state that raised the power ceiling beyond the range that had been formally validated for a 24-hour sustained run. Tate pushed back through the radio, citing the steering wheel vibration that had been building since hour 12 and the battery temperature trend that his in-car display was flagging. Caldwell told him the sensor was reading incorrectly and to hold the pace. What happened next was not visible from the grandstand. Rowan, running a lap behind the R9 on the oval, noticed the way the hot air rolling off the larger car's rear diffuser had changed character, a slight irregularity in the plume that an engineer who had spent 2 decades studying thermal behavior in moving vehicles would recognize as the signature of a system running past its equilibrium point. He had seen it before on a test day 11 years ago, just before a car came back to the pit on reduced power. From inside the Hale Rook, Rowan keyed the team radio and told Mara what he was seeing. She confirmed the battery temperature trend she was tracking on her monitor matched the profile. He told her he was going to pull the R9 in. She was quiet for a moment, then told him he understood what that meant for the record. He did. He pulled the Hale Rook out of its racing line, reduced pace, and drove across the infield access road to the Wexford pit entrance. He stopped the car, stepped out, and said into the nearest open radio channel that the Dominion R9 needed to come off the track. The instruction produced immediate chaos. Caldwell appeared on the pit wall within 90 seconds and accused Rowan of manufacturing a safety concern to halt the competition. At the moment, his car was failing to keep pace. The Wexford communications team was already drafting a statement. Rowan did not argue. He wrote 3 numbers on the back of a timing sheet. 3 temperature readings he predicted would appear in the R9's battery management log for the next sequential laps if the car continued, and handed the paper to the nearest official. He said if those numbers appeared, the vehicle needed to stop. Tate Brennan heard this from inside the car, checked his own instrument feed against the written prediction, and made a choice that had nothing to do with corporate loyalty. He brought the R9 into the pit under his own authority. When the technical team opened the battery access panel, the outermost cell array showed visible thermal deformation. The cells had swollen from absorbed heat, a condition that in 3 to 5 more laps at performance mode would have triggered an automatic power cutoff at racing speed. Caldwell stood on the pit wall and said nothing. Celeste, who had been watching data on a personal device after being formally excluded from the engineering decision chain, walked to the Wexford technical director and told him to get Rowan's input on the cool-down procedure. Rowan provided a heat extraction sequence from memory, a process for safely drawing residual energy out of an overbuilt battery pack without causing cell degradation, and declined both compensation and conditions. He said he wanted to finish the race, and he wanted to do it against a functioning car. The technical director applied the procedure. The R9 returned to the track 31 minutes after it had come in, running within safe parameters, and resumed competition. The stop had cost Rowan 9 minutes of racing time. To break the record, he needed to maintain an average speed above 201.8 miles per hour for every remaining minute of the event. His current average, accounting for the time he had spent in the Wexford pit, was below that threshold by a margin that a team with unlimited resources and a proven car would find difficult to close. With 42 minutes remaining in the event, the transmission coupling on the rear cooling pump cracked under cyclic fatigue stress. It was not a component that had ever failed in testing, because nothing in the development program had pushed the car this hard for this long. If it was replaced with a new unit, the installation time would eliminate any possibility of breaking the record. If it was not replaced, the cooling circuit would lose pressure within 15 minutes, and the engine would overheat before the final hour concluded. Rowan climbed out of the car, looked at the fractured piece, and told the team they had 7 minutes to fabricate something that did not exist. Eli assessed the broken coupling, took the handle from a specialty torque tool in the bottom drawer of the cart, and clamped it in the vise. Mara cut the required dimensions from memory, using measurements she cross-referenced against a photograph of the original part on her phone. The machined coupling was not identical to the original. It was slightly thicker at the base and carried a relief cut that allowed for thermal expansion under high load. The competition authority official observing the repair confirmed that the modified component did not alter the engine's fundamental operating specification and cleared the car to continue. The total stop time was 11 minutes and 40 seconds. The Hale Rook returned to the track. What followed was not heroic in the cinematic sense. Rowan did not drive the final laps with reckless aggression or make a dramatic last-minute charge. He drove with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much was available in the car beneath him and exactly how much was required to reach a specific number. He kept the new coupling cool by modulating engine load through the long turns, running slightly less power at the apex where thermal stress peaked and recovering the time on the straight sections where the system could breathe. He listened to the engine the way a doctor listens to a patient, not for what the instruments reported, but for what the sounds beneath the instruments implied. In the final 20 minutes, the timing screen showed a projected average that could land within a fraction of a mile per hour either side of the record. The margin was small enough that the outcome was genuinely uncertain until the final lap. When the 24-hour signal sounded and the Hale Rook completed its last pass across the timing line, the official average speed read 202.4 miles per hour. The record of 201.8 had stood for 11 years. The new one was 0.6 of a mile per hour faster. The crowd in the grandstand reacted with the kind of noise that comes from people who have watched something they did not expect to be possible. Rowan brought the car to the pit, shut it down, and requested that the competition authority begin its verification process immediately. Fuel samples, component inspection, data review, and a full audit of the repair log. He sat on the pit wall while the process ran and did not celebrate. The verification took 2 hours. During that time, an auditor reviewing the sealed Dominion R9 competition data discovered what the qualifying official had begun to identify the day before. The power management core running the R9 was built on a logic framework bearing Rowan Hale's technical signature, consistent in structure and methodology, with design documentation in the competition authority's possession dating to the original Dominion R7 program. The auditor escalated the finding to the event's technical committee and then to the Federation's Integrity Division. Celeste was informed as the verification was concluding, and she made a decision she had been preparing to make since the night she found the deleted temperature warning in the company's backup archive. She walked to the main stage, waited for the record verification to be formally announced, and then addressed the assembled press, officials, and audience. She confirmed that the company had commissioned an internal review of the termination proceeding against Rowan Hale, that the review had identified data manipulation in the incident documentation submitted to the board, and that Preston Caldwell had been suspended pending a formal investigation into falsification of engineering records, unauthorized filing of legal proceedings, and misappropriation of technical authorship across multiple programs dating back more than a decade. She did not hedge the statement or qualify it for legal protection. She accepted personal responsibility for acting on a falsified record without verification. Caldwell did not appear publicly. By the time Celeste finished speaking, he had already retained legal counsel. The board of Wexford Automotive met the following week and tendered a formal reinstatement offer to Rowan Hale, with the title of Chief Engineering Officer and a compensation package designed to communicate the seriousness of the proposal. Rowan declined. He had spent 17 years inside a structure where a single administrator could erase a person's contribution from every official document in the company overnight, and he had no interest in returning to a position where that structure remained intact around him. He made a counterproposal instead. He would establish a separate entity, Hale Advanced Performance, that would operate as an independent engineering partner to Wexford on a contractual basis, with terms binding on the company regardless of changes in board composition. The terms were 3. All patents arising from work conducted by Hale Advanced Performance would carry the name of the engineer who developed the underlying concept. The Safety Engineering Division would hold unilateral authority to suspend any test program, subject only to independent technical review, and engineers whose work contributed to commercialized products would receive a defined share of the resulting revenue. Celeste agreed to the terms and secured them personally, pledging a portion of her own equity stake as collateral to ensure the agreement could not be dissolved by a future board without triggering financial penalties that would make dissolution impractical. The formal signing was witnessed by Mara Quinn, Eli Boone, and Delaney Pierce. In the weeks that followed, both the Dominion R7 and the Hale Rook were placed on display in the Wexford Automotive Demonstration Facility at the Nevada Test Complex. The information panels for both vehicles were revised. The R7 panel now listed the complete development team, including Rowan Hale as the engineer responsible for the silent pulse thermal distribution system. The Hale Rook panel listed 6 names. Avery drove out to see the display on a Saturday afternoon and stood between the two cars for a long time, studying the one her father had built and the one he had unknowingly built 11 years earlier. She turned and asked him why he had pulled into the Wexford pit during the race, why he had stopped a run that was finally going his way to warn the people who had spent a year and a half trying to stop him. Rowan looked at the two vehicles for a moment before answering. He said that he had not needed to destroy Wexford to win. He had only needed the truth to move faster than the lie. At the far end of the facility, through the glass wall of the main observation room, Celeste was reviewing preliminary specifications for a new program. The first joint project between Wexford and Hale Advanced Performance, a vehicle built around safety architecture rather than maximum performance metrics. On the record board at the entrance to Red Mesa Proving Grounds, the corporate logo that had occupied the top position for 11 years had been shifted to a secondary position. Above it, in plain block lettering, was a single line that could not be altered, appealed, or administratively revised, designed and driven by Rowan Hale.